Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Joint House-Senate Spending Affordability Committee. This is our annual meeting where we set budget decisions for the this year FY24 budget parameters. I'm joined by co-chair Senator Jim Rosepep. Senator Rosepep, any comments before we hear from the Department of Legislative Services?
Yeah, I'll just make the comment that this committee and this undertaking is important every year, but it's in ways important in a different way this year, in the sense it's our second year, obviously, of the big budget surplus with projections of good financial times for at least the next few years. But it's also the start of a new administration in the executive branch and the beginning of the new constitutional rules in which the legislature will play a larger role in the annual budget process. So I think this year, particularly setting these parameters in a way that we can all work together effectively, I think is an extremely important undertaking.
I agree. A new season, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that. With that, I think we will now turn to the Department of Legislative Services, unless either of the presiding officers wanted to say anything at the top. Okay. I think we're going to start with Teresa and an update on the Board of Revenue estimates that just came out a few minutes ago.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we could share the screen and show you the charts. Yes, the Board of Revenue Estimates literally just met, an hour before this meeting is taking place. And they have adopted a new, as they do every December, new revenue forecast. And this chart shows you what they did. Overall, it's a very small change, just $56 million in fiscal 23. That's just a 0.2% change. That's a positive. But they did bring the estimate down in fiscal 2024 by $167 million. That's a 0.7% change. In terms of the growth, they're projecting ongoing revenues to be up 2.4% in fiscal 23 and 2.3% in fiscal 24. Among the big four revenue sources, there is a downward revision in both the income tax and the lottery, while the corporate income tax and the sales tax have both been remained unchanged. In the case of the corporate income tax, very late in the process of developing these estimates, we learned that the reporting of year-to-date corporate collections had some issues. That made it very difficult to know where the corporate income tax was vis-a-vis the September estimate. And therefore, the board chose to just leave the corporate income tax estimate alone for now and take another look at it in March. By that point, we'll have a clear understanding of where we are with the corporate income tax. In the case of the sales tax, though, the sales tax is tracking very closely to the September estimate. In addition, the board, in their revised economic outlook, they made very small changes to their forecast of employment and wages and personal income, all of it, which would normally affect the sales tax. And that's another factor in the lack of a revision to the sales tax. The one area of the economic outlook that did change significantly was capital gains income. We talked about capital gains quite a lot at the first SAC meeting. The board, if you remember from the November meeting, the board in September used a forecast of capital gains from Moody's Analytics. Moody's updated that forecast in November, and they did bring the drop in capital gains income in both this current year, 2022, and next year, 2023. They now are forecasting larger declines in capital gains income than they had been behind the September forecast. And that is the key reason behind the downward revision to the personal income tax. The total personal income tax collections, both state and local, were revised down by $325 million in fiscal 23 and $540 million in fiscal 24. However, every December, the board updates their estimate of the local share of the income tax, and they factor in the most recent tax year returns. Now we have tax year data for tax year 21, and when they factored those returns in, it actually lowered the local share. And thus, if the local share is lower, the state share is higher. And so that partially offsets the downward revision to the income tax for the general fund. It doesn't mean the locals are getting any less revenue than they're entitled to. It doesn't have any effect on that. It's just an estimate for the purposes of how much money goes into the local income tax reserve account. But it does affect this bottom line general fund forecast of the personal income tax. The revisions to the lottery and the other sources were mostly to bring revenues in line with year-to-date collections. If we can go to the next chart, We did update two charts that existed that we, oh, I'm sorry. I guess we did not do that. Okay, but I think that's all I have to say.
All right, we
Great.
can move on to there's in the next chart. Yeah, so the next chart just updates what we showed you in November in terms of the structural outlook and the cash outlook. It's been updated for two things: the revenue adjustments that Teresa just spoke about, and also the retirement system put out its out-year estimates from its actuary in early December, which actually brought retirement costs down a little bit versus our baseline. So we adjusted for that in the out years. It had no effect on fiscal 23 or 24. So what the chart shows is much like in early November on a structural basis, which is the bars. Ongoing revenues are more than enough to cover the projected ongoing spending, with surpluses of about 1.4 billion in 24 and 25. And then the surplus starts to tail off a little bit, but even by fiscal 28, you're still looking at a structural surplus of about 700 million. And the line just shows you the cash if you don't spend it. Now, obviously, you'll take actions this session that will use some of that cash. So you'll never build a cash balance like shown there. But based on our baseline alone, you would continue to grow the cash balance each year. And we're in a very healthy position. Important to remember that this forecast sets aside 10% of the rainy day fund. So that cash balance is on top of leaving 10% of revenues in the rainy day fund. That 10% is the equivalent of $2.5 billion in the rainy day fund. So that's kind of the overview of what's changed since November. If there are no questions, we can move to the draft report.
Does anybody have any questions about the BRE estimates and updated forecast? I don't see any, Dave. Please continue.
Okay, can we, let's put, great. So I don't know if we can make that a little bit bigger for people to read. So the recommendations, I think this is also emailed out to you all, so hopefully you have a version on your computer. The first area of recommendation relates to the structural budget, which is one of the areas that statute requires you to make a recommendation. And there's a lot of text here, but the bottom line is it says that there should be $100 million structural surplus at the end of fiscal 24. And basically what you're saying there is don't use every dollar you could to spend on structural this year, because as you saw, the structural surplus does taper off in the out years. So just suggesting a little bit of caution in terms of structural. And then it expresses the kind of the intent in terms of what the priorities are for using the money, most notably being investing in the state workforce, as well as expanding the availability of behavioral health services. In addition, it talks about making one-time investments in transportation infrastructure, as well as sort of shoring up our blueprint fund so that you're able to meet all the K through 12 education commitments the General Assembly has made in the recent years. Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you want to just go through the whole report or you want to vote on each section.
I think what we've done before is voted on the whole report unless someone wants to pull a piece out. So I think we should just continue and we can do questions at the end as well.
Very good. All right, the second area of recommendation relates to the general fund balance. Again, you have to make a recommendation on general fund balance, but it also contains some recommendations in terms of what to do with that large cash surplus that the state has. So I'll just go through the bullet points. So the first bullet point just says that you want to end fiscal 24 with a general fund balance of at least $350 million. This is an unusually high general fund recommendation for SAC, but it kind of reflects the uncertainty with some worries about recession, and our capital gains revenue is still assumed to be well above kind of the recent the 10-year average. So it provides a little bit of protection there. The second bullet point relates to the rainy day fund and just indicates a desire to maintain 10% of general fund revenues. The rainy day fund, again, is a protection against an economic downturn. Then if we go to the next page, there's a couple more bullets. Then it suggests committing cash, since you'll have a lot of cash, one-time money, toward PAYGO. And then the last two bullets talk about, to the extent practical, trying to address some of the state's unfunded liabilities, and then finally allocating one-time revenues to support important state investments, including the state workforce, education, and transportation. So those are kind of the operating budget recommendations. This third area is capital budget. Again, this is a statutory requirement that you make a recommendation here. There's a lot of text involved here. I'll try to hit the high points. The most significant, I suppose, is that you're proposing a GO authorization level of $1.2 billion. That's basically double what the Capital Debt Affordability Committee recommended at $600 million. The Capital Debt Affordability Committee was recommending kind of a historically low, at least for the last 20 years, level of GO debt given all of the cash. The $1.2 billion is consistent with what Spending Affordability Committee recommended last December to do for fiscal 24. And then you indicate that there's likely to be a need for a significant amount of pay-go on top of that $1.2 billion to meet all of the capital commitments that the state has already made, as well as address some new needs. And then there's some bullet points sort of highlighting specific things, including that you want money used to fund the projects that were pre-authorized last session for about $360 million of legislative priorities pre-authorized last session for fiscal 24. And then it also said that we need to recognize that bond premium revenues are going to come up short in fiscal 23, probably be about $200 million, and that we need to backfill those for projects that were authorized in the 23 budget would be reduced. Then kind of recognizing construction inflation. One of the things that's recommended here is putting extra money into the construction contingency fund, which is a fund that's used when bids come in for a project above what was budgeted. We've had that happen already a couple of times in the current fiscal year in the kind of inflation environment we're in. That's likely to continue in the next year. So just giving a little flexibility to respond to higher than expected bids. And then on the next page, it's a suggestion to, if possible, allocate money to facilities renewal, both in terms of money to actually do facilities renewal at state agencies, their buildings, but also that there may need to be some additional staffing at the Department of General Services to manage that facility renewal effort. And then finally, it just indicates the money should be set aside for NGO bonds for allocation for General Assembly projects. And then the very last part of this, in bold, the end of that section, talks about looking forward that next year, the authorizations should be inflated by about 4% to try to keep up with inflation, to maintain your buying power, if you will. All right, the next section, letter B there in the middle of the page, higher education debt. This is an area you make a recommendation every year. The University System of Maryland has indicated a desire to do about $30 million of academic debt. The Capital Debt Affordability Committee recommended the same $30 million, and this would just conform with the USM recommendation and the Capital Debt Affordability Committee, and it's consistent with kind of a long-term plan for the university. All right, then the next section there starts at the bottom of the page. The bold part is on the top of the next page. Relates to state employment. As you know, there's extraordinarily high level of vacancies in state government. About 13% of all state positions are vacant at the moment. There are substantially fewer filled positions today than in 2010, about 14% fewer. So there's a lot of workforce challenges the state is facing. The recommendation at the top of the next page is the committee is concerned about this high level of vacancies, and that given the large structural surplus, that it's time for the administration and the General Assembly to take efforts to restaff and adequately fund state government operations. All right, and the final area of recommendation, this is a new area. You changed the statute last year to include transportation in the recommendations. And there are two, consistent with what statute requires you opine on. The first is a closing transportation trust fund balance of $200 million fiscal 24. This is consistent with the draft CTP. It's consistent with what MDOT has been doing in recent years. They use this money during the year as kind of cash flow. So I think this is, the appropriate amount to provide them with flexibility that they need. And then the second bullet relates to how much money should go to system preservation. And the recommendation is $1.2 billion. This is slightly less than what MDOT has in the draft CTP. But again, it says a minimum of $1.2 billion, so it doesn't preclude doing more. And it's about 150 million more than the average that's been spent on system preservation over the last 10 years. Mr.
Excuse
Chairman,
me.
that's the summary of all of the recommendations. Happy to answer any questions.
Excuse me, I'm in the office. There's a fire alarm going off, so I'm gonna head out. Sorry. I don't know if
Good luck.
anybody else is in the building. Yeah, I'm in my office. All righty.
Take care.
Are there any questions besides what the source of the fire is in the Senate office building? I don't see any. Dave, I have a couple briefly. So just first of all, on the recommended fund balance, the 350 million, I think it was, or 300 million, what was the
350, sir.
350? And you said that's historically high?
That's the largest, I believe, spending affordability is recommended in at least 20 years.
Okay, and on the rainy day fund balance recommendation of 10%, that's sort of higher than certainly the years I've been here in terms of the recommendation.
It's unusually high. Last year, I believe you also were at 10%, but it's an unusually high. The state has only had 10% of the rainy day fund, I think 3 times in the last 30 years. So it preserves a lot of money as a hedge against recession and those concerns.
Okay. And the capital budget recommendation is kind of consistent with last year, factoring in what we sort of recommended last year.
Correct.
And that other group that meets to talk about it, their recommendation was historically low.
Correct.
Okay. And then on the state workforce, the vacancy rate is historically high.
Yes, it's the highest that we are aware of, anytime, at least in the last 30 years.
Great. This is quite an historic SAC meeting. Are there any other questions? Okay. Is there a motion on the report?
Move to adopt the report.
Second.
Moved by Senator Rosepep, moved by Chair Barnes, seconded by Chair Rosepep. Any debate? Okay, all in favor of adopt?
I would actually like to make a comment, Mr. Chairman.
Of course. Sorry, Mr.
I wanted
Chairman.
to kind of pull together the questions you asked. I mean, the questions you asked and the answers you got make very clear that this is a fiscally responsible approach. It's designed to take the good times and be prudent. That when we have less good times, we have money in the bank and don't get into problems. So I just want to emphasize that when you wrap all these things together, there's a strategy here to be very fiscally prudent for the state.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All in favor of adopting the SAC report, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Great. The ayes have it. I believe the SAC report is submitted, and I don't believe of any other business, Mr. Chairman Rosepep.
We're good to go.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. See you in January.
Happy holidays.
See you all in January.